Margaret Foster had always been the kind of woman who lived her life in carefully measured lessons. For 43 years, she had stood at the front of classrooms in Nashville, Tennessee, guiding children through the confusion of fractions, the fear of public speaking, and the fragile moments when life pressed too hard on young shoulders. She was not famous, not rich, not someone the world would ordinarily remember. But in April of 2024, Margaret made a choice that would place her name in millions of hearts. It was a Thursday morning in Atlanta, the sky a soft gray with streaks of light breaking through after an overnight storm, when Margaret boarded a van with her children and grandchildren. The destination was not a hospital, though she had been in and out of one for months. It was not a church, though she had been praying every day. No, her final trip in full health was to a brightly lit television studio, home of the game show Family Feud. Few around her suspected what this day truly meant. Her family had begged her to rest. Carol, her oldest daughter, sat beside her in the van, clutching Margaret's hand tightly. Carol had watched her mother's decline, the way the disease carved shadows beneath her skin, how the weight dropped off her frame until her bones pressed against her blouse. "Mom," she whispered, voice trembling as she smoothed the sleeve of Margaret's cardigan. "Are you sure you want to do this? We can still go back. We can spend the day together at home, quietly, peacefully." Margaret's reply was a soft laugh, though it caught in her throat. "Carol, darling, I've spent my whole life teaching people how to stand tall when life tries to push them down. If I go out quietly, what lesson will that be? This isn't just for me. It's for all of you, for every student I ever taught, for every child who believed courage was only for superheroes. I need them to see that it belongs to ordinary people too." The van pulled into the studio lot, and as the family stepped out, studio assistants hurried forward, cheerful and efficient, unaware that they were helping a woman who had less than a day left to live. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee. Ordinary details, but Margaret inhaled them deeply, as if memorizing every particle. For her, every sensation was magnified. The chatter of the crew, the squeak of polished shoes against the floor, the hum of cameras coming to life. Each sound reminded her that this was not just another Thursday. This was her last Thursday. Inside, the Foster family was briefed by producers. Margaret stood among them, her posture surprisingly strong despite the pain that pressed against her ribs. She listened carefully, nodded politely, even joked with her grandson about how they'd better not embarrass her on television. Yet beneath her composure, her secret throbbed like a second heartbeat. That morning, before the van had arrived, Margaret had signed the final paperwork at the hospital. At exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, her life support would be withdrawn. She had chosen dignity over prolonging the inevitable. That decision had liberated her. This game show taping was not just a family activity. It was her curtain call, her final performance before the lights dimmed for good. The rival family, the Colemans from Birmingham, were already seated on the opposite side of the stage. They were loud, laughing, competitive, and completely unaware that the quiet grandmother across from them carried the heaviest truth of all. Margaret smiled at them kindly, even as she felt her legs tremble. She had taught hundreds of children how to walk into classrooms when they were terrified, how to raise their hands even when they feared the answer would be wrong. Today she was practicing her own advice. Fear was natural. Courage was doing it anyway. The show began with applause echoing through the studio. Steve Harvey strode onto the stage, sharp suit gleaming, grin wide, energy bouncing across the crowd. To Margaret, it was like watching sunlight walk into the room. He had made millions laugh, but today, unknowingly, he was about to shepherd one woman toward her final joy. As the opening rounds unfolded, Margaret played along with gusto, her answers clear, her wit intact. When Steve cracked a joke about Southern grandmothers knowing best, Margaret winked at him, and the audience roared. No one knew why his laughter meant so much to her, how it filled a hollow place in her chest where fear had tried to settle. Through those first rounds, Margaret felt suspended between two worlds. One was ordinary, buzzers, applause signs, teammates shouting answers, Steve raising his eyebrows dramatically. The other was extraordinary, a clock ticking silently in her mind, counting down the hours she had left. Each second became sacred. Every time her granddaughter squeezed her hand in encouragement, she memorized the pressure. Every burst of applause became a hymn. Every glance at Steve Harvey, so full of warmth, reminded her why she had chosen this place. Laughter, family, connection. This was what life was about. This was how she wanted to be remembered. By the end of the second round, Margaret could feel her body tiring. Her breath grew shorter, her pulse faster. She kept smiling, but Carol noticed. She leaned in and whispered, "Mom, do you need to sit this round out?" Margaret shook her head firmly, eyes shining. "No, sweetheart. I need to stay. I need to finish." And then, as the lights dimmed for a commercial break, Margaret made her choice. She lifted her hand slightly, just enough for Steve Harvey to see. When he approached with his usual easy charm, she touched his arm gently, her fingers cool against his sleeve. "Mr. Harvey," she said softly, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. "May I speak with you privately for just a moment?" Steve, unaware of the storm gathering in her words, nodded without hesitation. "Of course, ma'am. What's on your mind?" And in that instant, Margaret Foster prepared to unveil the secret that would forever transform a simple game show, taping into the most unforgettable lesson of her life. Steve Harvey leaned closer to Margaret Foster, his familiar grin softening into genuine curiosity. The hum of the studio around them faded as stagehands bustled and cameras powered down for the short break. Contestants were stretching, producers whispering notes, and audience members chattering. But in the small space between Margaret and Steve, it felt like silence had settled over everything. She still had her hand lightly on his arm, her grip surprisingly steady for someone whose body had been weakened by months of pain. "Mr. Harvey," Margaret repeated, her voice barely above the murmur of the crowd, "what I need to tell you will change the way you feel about this whole show today." For a man who had heard nearly everything, wild confessions, emotional family stories, and contestants blurting out the strangest answers, Steve suddenly felt a flicker of unease. Her tone wasn't the nervousness of a contestant wanting reassurance. It carried a weight that made him straighten his posture. His eyes searched her face, and for the first time that day, he noticed the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the pale undertone of her skin, and the way her smile seemed to hold back something much deeper. Margaret drew in a breath, steady and deliberate, as though she were about to start one final lesson. "Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, she began, her eyes locked on his. "I'll be in hospice care for the last time. The machines that keep me alive will be turned off. My body won't hold on much longer." Steve blinked. The words hung between them, almost unreal against the bright set and the neon Family Feud logo glowing above. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard. Game shows weren't places for conversations about mortality. They were places for laughter and lighthearted rivalry. But Margaret's gaze held him steady. There was no mistaking what she'd said. "Ma'am, you mean to tell me, tomorrow—" His voice caught, his usual charisma faltering. "Yes, sir," Margaret said calmly, almost serenely. "Tomorrow will be my last day. Today is all I have left. And I chose to spend it here, with my children, my grandchildren, and with you. Because this show," she gestured faintly toward the stage, "represents everything I've tried to live for. Laughter, family, connection, joy." Steve exhaled slowly, and for once he had no comeback, no joke, no ready-made line. He was a man who had built a career on words, but standing here, listening to Margaret Foster, he realized there were moments where words could only fall short. "Does your family know?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. "They know I'm dying," Margaret admitted. "They don't know that tomorrow is the day. I didn't want them to look at me with grief in these last hours. I wanted them to celebrate, to laugh, to remember me smiling, not crying. I couldn't let them carry that sorrow into this studio." Her composure was astonishing. Steve felt his chest tighten. He glanced over her shoulder at her family, chatting animatedly, their faces glowing under the studio lights, unaware of the finality of what was happening. The sheer contrast almost broke him. Margaret leaned closer, her voice gentle but firm. "I didn't tell you for pity or special treatment. I told you because when someone spends their last day with you, you deserve to know. And I want you to treat this show exactly as you would have. Keep the jokes, keep the fun, keep the rhythm, but give me your full attention because this is the last audience I will ever stand before." Steve swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had been in many extraordinary situations on Family Feud, but never like this. This wasn't just television anymore. This wasn't just entertainment. It was sacred. He nodded slowly, his usual sparkle replaced by something quieter, deeper. "Mrs. Foster," he said, his voice low with reverence, "it is my honor, my absolute honor, to share this day with you. I promise you we're going to make this the most joyful Family Feud you've ever seen." Margaret's lips curved into a small, grateful smile, and she released his arm. The moment between them was brief, but it carried the weight of eternity. The stage manager called out that cameras would be rolling in 30 seconds. Steve turned back to his podium, but he walked differently now. The bounce in his step was gone, replaced by a deliberate, almost solemn determination. He wasn't just a host anymore. He had been entrusted with someone's final wish. That knowledge filled every movement, every glance, every breath he took from that moment on. When the cameras switched back on, the audience erupted into applause, oblivious to the revelation that had just taken place. Steve smiled as he always did, but it was different now. He wasn't performing. He was present, deeply present, in a way that few television hosts ever had to be. Margaret played the next round with even greater enthusiasm. She clapped for her grandchildren's answers, shouted encouragement across the stage, and laughed freely at Steve's jokes. Yet every gesture was sharpened by the truth Steve now carried. Each smile, each cheer, each burst of laughter was not just an act of fun, it was a farewell, a deliberate choice to fill her final hours with joy instead of sorrow. Steve found himself watching her more closely than anyone else. When she pressed the buzzer, he leaned forward with extra attention. When she gave an answer, his laughter rang out louder, richer. He was determined that every moment Margaret Foster spent under those lights would feel honored, elevated, unforgettable. But inside, he struggled. How could he continue to act as though this was just another episode when he knew what tomorrow held? He caught himself choking back emotion, and once, when the camera swung away from him, he wiped the corner of his eye quickly before facing the crowd again. Margaret noticed. Her eyes softened. She gave him a small nod as though to say, "It's all right. You're doing exactly what I hoped." And so the game continued. To everyone else, it was Family Feud as usual. But to Steve Harvey and Margaret Foster, every second was extraordinary, precious, and final. The show moved toward its next break, and Steve knew that soon, the moment would come when Margaret's strength would falter and her secret would begin to cast its shadow over the whole studio. The studio lights blazed back to full intensity as the Foster family advanced through the third round. The atmosphere for the audience was electric, just another taping filled with laughter, applause, and playful rivalries. But for Steve Harvey, it was as if the room had split into two realities. One where the show was unfolding as it always did, and another where every tick of the clock brought Margaret Foster closer to her final sunrise. He carried that secret like a stone in his chest, and yet he also felt a quiet responsibility to make her last day gleam brighter than all the rest. Margaret herself seemed to radiate a strange, luminous energy. Her frail body betrayed exhaustion with each passing minute. But her spirit had never shone so brightly. She laughed at her grandson's goofy answer, clapped enthusiastically for her daughter, and even teased Steve with the ease of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her composure stunned him. The courage it took for her to be here, to stand before hundreds of strangers, smiling while carrying the knowledge that tomorrow she would be gone, was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. And then came the moment that shifted the entire studio. The Foster family had clawed their way into the final round. Fast money. It was the dream of every contestant, but tonight it carried more weight than anyone realized. Steve turned toward the family with his usual showman flair, but his voice carried a reverence that the audience couldn't quite place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his hand gesturing toward Margaret, "we're about to see something special." Margaret stepped forward. The crowd cheered loudly, thinking only that this grandmother was about to have her shot at the big prize. But Steve knew better. He saw her not just as a contestant, but as a woman stepping into her final act, her last stage, her last performance before the curtain fell. He caught her eye, and for a brief moment, the rest of the studio faded away. In that silent exchange, she reminded him with a simple glance, "This isn't about winning money. This is about living fully." One last time. As she placed her hands on the podium, Steve steadied himself. He asked the first question with deliberate clarity, his voice carrying more gravity than usual. "Name something teachers do that parents appreciate." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Listen to their children," she replied, her tone firm, her eyes sparkling. The board lit up with 32 points, and the audience clapped. To them, it was a good answer. To Steve, it was a declaration of who she had always been. The second question came, "Name something people do when they're proud." Margaret smiled softly, the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes deepening. "Smile," she said, almost as if she were reliving every proud glance she had ever exchanged with a student or her own children. 28 points. Applause echoed again. Each answer carried the essence of her life. When asked what gets better with age, she whispered, "Wisdom," and Steve felt his throat tighten as the board revealed another strong score. For the question about what children remember about their favorite teacher, Margaret's voice wavered but didn't break. "They cared about me." The words rolled through the studio like a quiet storm. The crowd cheered. Steve's chest ached. He realized she wasn't just answering game show prompts. She was leaving behind her epitaph. By the time the final question came, "Name something that makes life worth living," Margaret paused. Her eyes swept over her family, her grandchildren beaming with pride, her daughter Carol wiping at tears she didn't yet fully understand. Then she spoke, with a calm certainty that made the audience hold its breath. "Love." The board lit up with 29 points. The Foster family's combined score was enough to win. The studio erupted, music blared, confetti streamed, and Margaret's family surged around her, cheering. But this was no ordinary celebration. Her children clung to her tightly. Her grandchildren cried tears of joy. And for Steve Harvey, the moment broke the barrier between performance and life. He stepped forward, pulling Margaret into a long, reverent embrace. He whispered softly, "Mrs. Foster, you've just taught us all the most important lesson of our lives." The cameras cut to commercial, but the emotion in the room did not. Crew members wiped their eyes. Audience members exchanged bewildered glances, sensing something deeper was happening without knowing why. And Steve, who had stood in front of countless crowds, who had weathered decades in show business, realized he was bearing witness to something sacred. Margaret Foster was not merely playing fast money. She was showing the world how to meet death not with despair, but with courage, laughter, and love. When filming resumed, Steve chose his words carefully. He did not reveal Margaret's secret. He had promised her that much, but he could not let the moment pass without acknowledging her. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rich with emotion, "you've just seen grace in action. You've just seen what courage looks like. Let's give this family the love they deserve." The audience roared with applause, some rising to their feet. Margaret, cheeks flushed, waved modestly, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. That applause wasn't just for a game show victory. It was a tribute, unknowingly, to a woman who had turned her final hours into a celebration. Steve knew it. Margaret knew it. And soon her family would too. As the episode drew to its close, Margaret stood with her family under the falling confetti, her arms wrapped around her grandchildren. Steve lingered nearby, unable to take his eyes off her. The cameras would never capture the truth, that tomorrow she would be gone. But the lesson she had delivered would outlive the lights, the applause, even her own heartbeat. In that moment, the game show set no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a sanctuary where the last chapter of one woman's life had become the most powerful sermon of all. When the taping ended and the studio audience filed out, there was a different kind of quiet that settled across the stage. The lights dimmed, the laughter softened, and the confetti lay scattered like echoes of joy clinging to the floor. The Foster family huddled together, still buzzing with victory, their voices tumbling over one another in celebration. But Steve Harvey did not rush away to his dressing room as he normally would. Instead, he stayed close. his presence quieter than usual, as though he understood that the moment required something more than entertainment. Margaret sat on a chair near the edge of the set, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a gentle smile resting on her lips. To everyone else, she was just tired from the long day of filming. To Steve, she was a woman nearing the end of her final act. He walked over and crouched slightly so he could meet her at eye level. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply studied her face, memorizing the calm lines of dignity, the strength etched into her gaze. Then he whispered, "Mrs. Foster, thank you for letting me be part of your last day. I'll never forget this." Her smile deepened. "Mr. Harvey, you gave me exactly what I wanted. Laughter, connection, family. You helped me walk into this final chapter with joy. That's all I could have asked for." Carol approached quietly, her brow furrowed in concern. She had begun to notice the fragility in her mother's movements, the way her breaths came shorter, the way her smile lingered just a little too long, as if to savor the seconds. She didn't yet know the truth, but she could feel something in her heart that words had not yet confirmed. She slipped her arm around her mother's shoulder. Margaret leaned into her daughter's warmth, pressing her cheek briefly against Carol's hair, as if anchoring herself in the love she had carried all her life. After the crew wrapped, Steve asked if he could spend a few more minutes with the family. They found a quiet corner backstage where the cameras were gone. The applause was only a memory, and the hum of the studio felt distant. There, Margaret spoke not as a contestant, but as a teacher one last time. She told stories of her classroom days, how a shy boy once learned to read under her encouragement, how a girl who had nearly dropped out of school had gone on to college because Margaret refused to give up on her. She told Steve and her family that courage wasn't about being fearless. "Courage," she said softly, "is showing up fully, even when you're afraid, even when you know your time is almost gone." Steve listened, his heart heavy and full at the same time. He had met presidents, athletes, celebrities, but sitting there with Margaret, he felt he was in the presence of something greater, an ordinary woman whose extraordinary choice to face her end with laughter and love was leaving behind a lesson no stage could contain. That night, Margaret returned home to Nashville with her family. They gathered in her living room, the television muted, photographs scattered on the coffee table. She asked for no sorrow, only stories. The grandchildren retold the funniest moments from the day's taping, giggling about Steve's expressions, mimicking the sound of the buzzer, reenacting her winning answers. Margaret laughed with them, the sound clear and musical despite her weariness. She looked around the room, eyes sweeping over her family as though she were memorizing every face. And perhaps she was. As the night deepened, Margaret grew quiet. She asked Carol to sit by her side and hold her hand. With her daughter's fingers wrapped around hers, she whispered, "Remember this night not for what's ending, but for what we celebrated. Love is the only thing that makes life worth living. Carry that with you, always." Carol's tears slipped silently down her cheeks, but she nodded, promising through her grief to honor her mother's wish. The next morning, as the spring sun rose over Nashville, Margaret entered hospice care. At exactly 10 o'clock, as she had planned, the machines were turned off. She passed peacefully, surrounded by her family, her final breath carrying a faint smile. Her departure was not marked by silence, but by the echoes of joy she had created the day before. Weeks later, when the episode aired, the world finally saw what Steve Harvey had experienced. He opened the show with a tribute, his voice thick with emotion. Today's episode is dedicated to Mrs. Margaret Foster, a teacher who spent 43 years shaping young minds and hearts. On this stage, she showed us what grace and courage look like. She reminded us that every day is a gift, and how we choose to spend it reveals everything about who we are. Viewers wept. Messages poured in from around the world. Teachers wrote to say they had found new inspiration. Families admitted they had decided to spend more time together. Volunteers signed up for hospice programs, inspired by her courage. Margaret's story spread far beyond the bright lights of Family Feud. Her former students created a scholarship fund in her name, dedicated to aspiring teachers who promised to care for their students with the same devotion Margaret had given. The fund's motto came from her fast money answer: "They cared about me." In hospice centers across the country, her story was told as an example of what it means to meet the end of life with dignity. Steve Harvey himself began weaving Margaret's lesson into his shows and speeches, reminding audiences that every laugh, every hug, every shared moment could be someone's last. For the Foster family, grief was softened by gratitude. Carol told anyone who asked that her mother's last day had been a gift, a living memory they would cherish forever. "Mom didn't just teach us how to live," she said. "She taught us how to face goodbye with love." And so Margaret Foster's legacy lived on, not in textbooks or headlines, but in the quiet moments of courage and kindness her story inspired. The woman who had once stood in classrooms teaching children about fractions and grammar had, in her final day, taught millions the most profound lesson of all: that joy is a choice, love is the answer. And how we spend our last day is the truest reflection of how we lived every day before it. Her life had ended, but her lesson endured, etched not in chalk on a blackboard, but in the hearts of everyone who heard her story.